That was the sound I will always remember, the hush between his bow and the strings. The space that didn't belong to music anymore. It was as if silence itself had taken shape in the dim rehearsal room, hovering between us like breath on frozen glass. My name is Amelia, and I restore old violins for a living. People think a luthier's workshop smells of varnish and sawdust. They're right, but they forget the faint perfume of grief that clings to every instrument. A violin remembers. It remembers the hands that trembled, the rooms that listened, the promises made in sound. When I first met Leon, he was standing by the window of the Salzburg Conservatory's old workshop, polishing a maple backplate. The winter sun fell through the panes, turning the dust into gold dust. His hair was dark, his fingers long and careful, fingers that moved like a prayer. He smiled when he noticed me watching. "You're the new restoration technician?" he asked. His voice was soft, the kind that made you believe it could never break anything. "Amelia," I said. "And you're the famous violin maker." He laughed quietly. "Famous is too large a word. I just make wood sing, when it allows me." That was how it began, to people trying to mend things that were once beautiful. Leon's studio was small, but full of light. Violins hung from the ceiling like sleeping birds. Each had a story, a scar, a melody caught in the grain. I would come by after my classes ended, pretending I needed his advice about cracks in sound posts. But really, I wanted to hear the way he talked about instruments like they had souls. He used to tell me, every violin carries a ghost. Our job isn't to exorcise it. It's to make peace. I believed him, maybe too much. We spent that winter wrapped in the scent of spruce and amber glue. I began to think of our lives as two notes of the same chord. And then one morning his ghost returned. Her name was Nora. I had heard about her before anyone told me. She was the violinist he once built for. Together they had crafted a legendary instrument called the Aurora, a violin so resonant that critics wrote about it like it was alive. But during a performance in Vienna, Nora disappeared after the final encore, leaving both the violin and Leon behind. He never told me what happened between them. I didn't ask. But when she walked into the conservatory that morning, carrying the Aurora in its weathered case, I felt the air change. "Leon," she said simply, as if no years had passed. He froze. His hands, usually steady, trembled just slightly. "Nora," he whispered. I stood beside the workbench, invisible in the sunlight. She was every inch the legend people spoke of, her hair tied loosely, her lips curved in that effortless, practiced smile musicians learn from applause. She placed the violin case on his table. "I need your hands again," she said. "The sound has gone dull." That night, he stayed late in the studio. I waited in the hallway, pretending to read a repair catalog, listening to the faint rhythm of his tools. Metal on wood, breath on silence. At midnight, I heard the first note. It was her violin's voice, aching, luminous, alive again. And then I heard his, not his voice, but the sigh that followed the sound of a man remembering. I left without saying goodnight. Outside, the snow had started to fall. It covered the cobblestones like quiet forgiveness. The bells of the cathedral chimed once, echoing down the narrow street. And I told myself it was just music, just another sound carried by winter air. But deep down, I knew. Every note he played from now on would be a conversation I wasn't invited to. The next morning, Leon didn't come to breakfast. His chair was empty, his coffee cup clean, as if he had never existed there at all. I found him hours later, in the workshop, half buried beneath curls of maple shavings. The violin lay open on the bench, its ribs exposed like the bones of a bird. He was murmuring to himself in Italian, a language I'd only ever heard when he spoke to his instruments, never to me. "Good morning," I whispered. He didn't hear me. Or maybe he pretended not to. I watched as he traced a crack along the Aurora's belly with a brush dipped in varnish. His hands were slow, reverent. "Too much humidity," he said finally, without looking up. "Nora played it in Vienna during the storm season. The wood swelled, then dried. The sound lost its clarity." He paused, then smiled faintly. "It's still beautiful though. She always made it sing." The words were soft, but they fell like stones. I wanted to tell him that I'd stayed late too. that I'd heard every trembling note last night, that it had sounded like heartbreak stitched into melody. But the words refused to leave me. Silence was safer, didn't betray how much I already knew. For days, the workshop lived and breathed around the aurora. I became an intruder in my own space. When I came in, they were already there. Leon bent over the workbench. Nora standing by the window, her laughter spilling like warm wine. She'd bring pastries from the cafe near the square, set them beside his tools, and hum while he worked. Sometimes, he joined her softly, a half-hummed harmony that used to belong to me. I started timing my arrivals to when she left, but she didn't leave often. One evening, I found a sheet of manuscript paper on his desk. The notes were smudged, but I could still read the title. Etude for the Absent, his handwriting hers above it, in blue ink, correcting his phrasing. I stared at the two handwritings intertwined like duet lines, and for the first time, I understood how music could be a form of touch. The snow deepened. The city grew quiet, heavy with white. Leon asked me to help him polish the fingerboard. I nodded, grateful to be needed again, even if it was just for my hands. He handed me a piece of fine cloth soaked in oil and turpentine. Careful, he said. It's an old wood. You have to move along the grain, not against it. I began to rub gently, circular, rhythmic motions, almost like breathing. The scent rose between us, oil, pine, and something faintly floral, her perfume, still clinging to the case. Leon was close enough for me to see the reflection of his eyes in the varnish. They say violins absorb everything, he murmured. The touch, the voice, the memory. Maybe that's why they never die. I stopped moving my hand. And what happens, I asked quietly, when the violin remembers someone who doesn't come back? He looked at me, then really looked in for a heartbeat. I thought he would say my name. But instead, he said hers. That night, I walked home without my coat. The cold bit through me, but it was easier to feel something than nothing. Every street corner hummed with faint music from the practice halls. It seemed that the whole city was learning the same lesson. How to love something that no longer sings for you. The rehearsal hall smelled of dust and old applause. That afternoon, Nora decided to play again. I heard her before I saw her, those first hesitant notes of the aurora echoing through the conservatory halls. It was a fragile sound, thin as breath, trembling like something newly born. Leon stood near the piano, watching her with the stillness of someone witnessing a ghost. When I entered, she lowered the bow, turning slightly toward me. "Oh," she said, smiling politely. "Leon told me you were helping with the restoration." I nodded. "Only the small repairs." Her eyes lingered on me a second too long, then returned to him. "Well, your work is lovely," she said. "It feels alive again." Alive again. I wanted to ask her if she knew what it cost for something dead to come back to life. They began rehearsing every evening after that. The conservatory lights burned late into the night, their glow visible from my apartment across the river. I could tell when he was working by the rhythm of the lamplight flicker, like the pulse of a heart refusing rest. Sometimes I walked past, pretending it was coincidence, only to stop beneath the window. Inside, her bow moved in perfect arcs, his hands guiding the bridge, adjusting, listening. There was intimacy in the way they breathed together. A rhythm I used to know. Once, when she missed a note, Leon's hand brushed hers to steady it. He laughed softly. "You still rush your crescendos." And she smiled. "You still think you can fix everything." They both laughed. I didn't. The next day, Leon asked me to check the varnish on an old student violin. I examined it mechanically, my hands moving out of habit. The wood was fine, the lacquer even, but all I could think of was the aurora, the way he spoke to it. Not like a craftsman, but like a man speaking to someone who once saved his life. As I worked, I noticed something strange, a faint line running down the old violin's back, invisible unless you tilted it against the light. A fracture, tiny, almost imperceptible, but real. When Leon passed by, I said quietly, "There's a hairline crack." He leaned close, inspecting it. "It's small, leave it. The wood will hold." "But it'll spread," I said. He smiled sadly. "Everything spreads, Amelia. Even silence." That night, I couldn't sleep. I dreamt of violins submerged underwater, their strings tightening until they snapped. When I woke, my hands were trembling, smelling faintly of varnish and grief. I walked to the river bank at dawn. The city was wrapped in mist, the world reduced to pale outlines, bridges, rooftops, swans drifting like lost thoughts. Somewhere, from an open window, the aurora sang again. The sound reached me slowly, crossing the fog like a confession. And I realized then, the thing about music is, it doesn't belong to who listens, only to the one brave enough to play. The first time I saw them under the stage lights, I understood how a room could turn into a wound. Nora was rehearsing for her return concerta charity performance for the conservatory. Leon had been asked to assist with sound adjustments and last-minute maintenance. When he told me, he added, "You could help backstage, if you'd like." I said yes, because I wanted to believe I could still belong somewhere inside his world. The theater smelled of velvet and memory. The seats were empty, rows of silent witnesses waiting to remember applause. Nora stood center stage, the aurora resting against her collarbone like a second heart. Leon was crouched beside the monitors, tuning the resonance. "Ready?" he asked. She smiled. "You tell me." And then she played. The first note pierced the room like light breaking through a cathedral window. Her sound wasn't perfect, it trembled at the edges. But Leon's expression said everything he heard what I couldn't. Forgiveness? He closed his eyes, following every rise and fall, his hand unconsciously mirroring her bow, two bodies moving in the same rhythm, as if time had folded to bring them back. I stood by the curtains, pretending to check the stage list. Each note felt like a pulse pressed against my chest. When she reached the final vibrato, Leon whispered, "There it is, the voice I remember." And she lowered her bow, smiling. "You never forgot it." The silence that followed was unbearable. I wanted to speak, to step forward, to break whatever spell the music had cast between them. But I stayed, because even silence can be loyal. After rehearsal, Nora left early for an interview. Leon lingered on stage, running his hand along the violin's bridge. "The tone is back," he said quietly. "It took months to understand what was missing." He looked up at me. It wasn't the wood, it was her. I swallowed the taste of varnish and bitterness. "So, what happens after the concert?" I asked. He smiled in that gentle way that made me want to forgive him to isolate. "She's traveling again. Europe tour. I'll help prepare the violin before she leaves." "Help prepare." He said it like a craftsman's duty, but his voice trembled like a confession. That night, I stayed in the empty hall long after everyone left. The air was thick with echoes, notes lingering in the rafters. I walked across the stage, my footsteps hollow. The aurora still lay on the piano bench, forgotten for the moment. I reached out, tracing the curve of its body. The wood was warm, alive. Somewhere beneath the varnish, I could feel their fingerprints layered over mine. For a moment I imagined smashing it, just to hear what silence sounded like when it finally won. Instead, I placed it gently back on the cloth, and whispered, "You've taken enough." But the violin only shimmered faintly in the dim light, as if it were still breathing. Outside, the city was asleep under snow. My reflection followed me through the glass doors of the conservatory, a ghost without sound. And as I walked home, the only thing I could hear was the echo of his voice, saying her name, over and over, until it blended with the wind. I began to avoid the workshop. The smell of resin, the glow of the lamp, the faint hum of strings, all of it carried his ghost. I started taking freelance repairs from nearby schools instead. Student violins, splintered bridges, broken cases, instruments that could be fixed without feeling. Leon noticed. "You're not around much," he said one afternoon, when I came to collect my tools. "I'm giving you space," I replied. He looked at me a long moment. "You don't have to." But he didn't ask me to stay, either. Winter pressed closer. Snow blurred the edges of everything. From my apartment window, I could see the conservatory lights again, their faint amber pulse. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, the sound of the aurora reached me soft, haunting, threaded with something too human to be just music. Once, late at night, Leon knocked on my door. He was carrying the violin case. She wants it adjusted again, he said. His breath formed clouds between us. Why bring it here? I couldn't work there tonight. He hesitated, then added, it doesn't sound the same anymore. I let him in. The air inside smelled of tea and varnish. He opened the case, revealing the aurora, the maple gleaming like candlelight. I reached for it out of habit, then froze. The neck joint had developed a tiny Fisher hairline, thin, but spreading. It's drying too fast, I said quietly. You need to keep it somewhere warmer. He nodded, but didn't move. Do you think, he whispered, it's possible for a violin to forget? I looked up at him. No, I said. But it can change who it sings for. For a heartbeat, silence hovered between us. Then he laughed softly, sadly. That's cruel, Amelia. I'm a restorer, Leon. My job is to stop things from breaking. But sometimes, breaking is all that's left. He left the violin with me that night. I didn't sleep. I sat by the table, polishing its edges, listening for breath between the strings. Every stroke of cloth brought back memories, his hands guiding mine, the scent of wood, the echo of promises never made aloud. By dawn, the crack was sealed. The surface looked whole again. But when I plucked a single string, the note rang hollow, like something repaired, not reborn. When Leon came to collect it, he looked relieved. She'll be glad, he said. She, Nora, of course. He thanked me, but his eyes stayed on the violin. And I understood then. I could mend the wood, polish the varnish, align the bridge. But I would never be able to tune his heart. That evening, I walked to the old cathedral. The doors were open. A student orchestra was rehearsing inside. I stood at the back, unseen, letting the music wash through me. Violins, cellos, 100 strings breathing in unison. And in that sea of sound, I realized I didn't want to be another ghost inside someone else's song. I walked home through falling snow. Behind me, the music faded into the distance. Beautiful, fleeting, like forgiveness too late to matter. The night before the concert, Salzburg felt suspended in glass. Snow fell without sound, and the city lights floated like small prayers. I was in my apartment, polishing the last student violin of the week, cheap spruce. Clumsy varnish, but innocent in its imperfection. When the knock came, I didn't need to ask who it was. Leon stood in the doorway, his coat half-buttoned, snow dusting his hair. He held nothing in his hands this time, not the violin, not excuses. Just himself. May I come in? I stepped aside. You always do. He smiled faintly. I shouldn't be here. Then why are you? Because everything sounds wrong tonight. He moved to the table where my lamp burned low. The half-finished violin glowed amber beneath his shadow. He touched the strings, then withdrew his hand, as if afraid of leaving marks. I thought fixing the aurora would give me peace, he said. But the more perfect it sounds, the emptier it feels. I said nothing. Words, I had learned, are poor instruments for truth. He turned toward me. You once told me violins remember. If that's true, then this one. He stopped. What about it? I asked. Then it remembers her. And you. He took a step closer. I could smell pine, rosin, and the faint ache of winter on his coat. I hear you in every note now, he whispered. Even when I don't want to. My heart should have quickened, but instead it stilled. Because I knew what he meant wasn't love, it was residue. The way varnish clings even after the wood has hardened. He sat down, exhaling as if he'd been running. Nora's performance is tomorrow. She's nervous. So am I. I forced a small smile. You always were, before a debut. He looked up. You'll be there, as staff. Backstage? He nodded slowly. Good. I'd like to think someone real is listening. Something in the way he said real hurt more than it should have. The clock ticked between us. Outside, the snow fell harder, wrapping the city in hush. He glanced at my workbench. What are you fixing? A school violin? Nothing special. He picked it up, studied the crude craftsmanship. It's honest, he said. Ugly, but honest. He drew a bow from the wall, tightened it, and without warning, played a single note. The sound was raw. It filled the small room, shivering the air. Then he stopped. That's what truth sounds like, he said quietly. It's never beautiful, just necessary. He placed the violin back down and looked at me with something like apology. I should go. He reached for the door, paused. Amelia, after tomorrow, things will change. I managed a nod. They already have. He hesitated 1 heartbeat longer, as if there were still a word left unsaid, then walked into the snow. I stood at the window until his figure disappeared into the white. In the distance, church bells began to toll midnight. I pressed my hand to the cold glass and whispered, Silence, I finally know your name. And in the reflection, for the first time, I saw myself not as the woman he left, but as the echo that survived. The concert hall was a cathedral of sound that night. Golden chandeliers floated above like captured constellations, and every seat was filled with faces waiting to remember beauty. Backstage, I stood among cables and shadows, clipboard in hand, pretending to belong. Leon was tuning the aurora beneath the lights. Nora paced slowly in her gown, pale blue silk rippling like water. They looked like the past resurrected, framed in gold. When she caught my eye, she smiled. Wish me luck, she said. You don't need it, I replied. My voice didn't tremble, though my hands did. Then she walked out into the brightness, and the hall fell into silence so deep, it felt like prayer. The first piece was one they had written together years ago. Nocturne for Two Broken Strings. A title that had once sounded romantic to me, now sounded prophetic. Her bow moved as if it knew the way home. Leon sat beside the piano, not playing, just listening, every note carving itself into him. The violin's tone was flawless, warm, mournful, alive. It was forgiveness disguised as melody. When she reached the bridge, the strings shivered. For a heartbeat, I thought they might snap under the weight of the sound, but they held like something refusing to die. I realized then, this was not a love reborn, but a requiem for what they once were. And yet, he looked at her as though it were beginning again. At intermission, I slipped outside. The night was bright with snow and distant applause. I leaned against the wall, breathing the cold until it burned. Through the door, I could still hear fragments of tuning the aurora sighing between songs. When Leon found me, he looked as if the stage light hadn't left him yet. You heard it, he asked. I did. What did you think? I looked at him for a long time. I think you fixed it, I said. He smiled, weary. Then why doesn't it feel fixed? He waited for an answer, but I had none left to give. The second half began. I stayed backstage, unseen. When Nora played the encore piece titled Lumiere, which means light, Leon watched her from the wings, hands clasped, eyes wet with something too quiet to name. When the final note faded, the audience rose, their applause thunderous. Nora bowed, radiant, and Leon stepped forward to take the violin from her hands. They stood together under the lights, the maker and his muse, the silence between them finally whole. And I knew, right then, that this was their ending. The kind that doesn't need words, the kind that leaves no room for anyone else's name. After the curtain fell, I slipped away before anyone noticed. Outside, the snow had stopped. The city shone pale, untouched. I walked without direction, the echo of the concert still inside me. A music I couldn't keep and couldn't forget. When I reached the river, I looked at my reflection, and for the first time, it didn't look like loss. It looked like beginning. After the concert, the city stayed awake longer than usual. Snow turned the cobblestones silver, and laughter drifted out from cafes where people still spoke of the music, of the aurora, of Nora's triumphant return. Leon didn't stay for the celebration. When the lights dimmed and the last curtain fell, he went back to the workshop. I wasn't there. He found my tools neatly arranged, my coat gone, my mug washed and turned upside down to dry. On the workbench lay a small envelope, sealed with red wax. Inside, a folded letter, and beneath it, the student violin I'd been repairing. It was unfinished. The varnish stopped halfway, the bridge unglued, the strings loose. But when the wind from the open window passed through, it made a faint, trembling hum. He touched the paper as though it might vanish. Leon, I've been trying to understand what silence means. I used to think it was emptiness, the space after loss. But now I know it's the sound that waits to be filled by something true. You once told me violins never die. Maybe that's why we break them so that we can start again. You've already begun your new song. I won't stay to be its echo. Take care of her. Take care of yourself. And if you ever hear my name inside a note, let it rest. Amelia. He read it twice, maybe 3 times. Then he set the letter down, turned the violin upright, and ran a bow gently across its unfinished strings. The sound that came out was rough, fragile. He closed his eyes. For the first time, the silence that followed didn't hurt. Outside, I was already on the train. The window blurred with frost. The rails hummed a steady rhythm beneath me. I carried no instruments, no plans, only the memory of hands that once tried to fix the As the train crossed the bridge, I looked back one last time. Salzburg was aglow in the snow, fading into distance. Somewhere inside that city, I had learned how to stop listening for a voice that wasn't mine. I rested my forehead against the glass, and in the quiet vibration of the wheels, I heard it at last. The sound of my own silence, turning into peace. The city I moved to was quiet in a different way. Not the reverent hush of concert halls, nor the haunted stillness of snow, just the ordinary silence of life beginning again. I rented a small room above a bookshop. The owner, an old cellist named Franz, gave lessons to children downstairs. Every morning I woke to the soft thrum of beginner scales, and even hesitant, alive. It was the sound of trying, and I loved it. I started teaching to, not restoration, not performance, just listening. I told my students, every instrument has a truth. It's our job to find it, not to force it. They nodded, though I wasn't sure they understood. Maybe I was teaching myself more than them. One afternoon, a parcel arrived. No return address. The handwriting on the paper was familiar. Inside was a small wooden box, plain and unvarnished. When I opened it, I found a single sheet of manuscript paper. No notes. Only the title, written in his steady hand. For the one who stopped listening. Beneath it, a short line of text. Some music doesn't need to be played to be heard. I stared at the page for a long time. Then I smiled. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't an apology. It was a silence given back to me. The one we had shared, now made gentle. That night, I placed the empty score on my work table. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the windows, and from the shop below came the sound of Franz's youngest student practicing scales again. The bow scraped, faltered, found its pitch. And somehow, between those clumsy notes, I heard the faintest echo of the aurora, not the melody itself, just its memory breathing quietly between the rests. I closed my eyes. Maybe that's what remains unplayed. The space where we learn that absence can sing. Years later, time had gentled everything. The ache, the longing, even the memories had faded into quiet colors like old varnish softening with age. My life had become small but steady. A handful of students, a sunlit studio, and the slow rhythm of mending what could be mended. Sometimes, when I adjusted a bridge or tightened a peg, I still caught myself listening. Not for his music, but for that invisible thread that once tied sound to sorrow. It was thinner now, almost gone, but it hummed, still like something alive beneath silence. One spring afternoon, the bookshop owner brought me an instrument someone had left behind. It's anonymous, he said. No label, no name. Thought you'd like to see it. The violin was simple, almost austere. The varnish had worn away around the edges. The grain was uneven, but honest. I turned it in, the light dance stopped. There, faintly etched near the tailpiece, were 4 letters. A-M-E-L. Not my full name, just the beginning of it. The engraving was rough, as though done in haste. But I knew that hand. I placed the violin on my lap, bowing the strings softly. The first sound it gave was thin, breathy. Then, slowly, it opened. The tone was warm, trembling, imperfect, alive. Inside the F-hole, tucked beneath the soundpost, I saw something folded, a small strip of paper. With tweezers, I pulled it out. Only one line, written in fading ink. Even silence can remember its maker. I sat there for a long time, the note trembling in my fingers. No tears came. Only a kind of peace that felt like forgiveness finally finding its echo. That evening, I took the violin to the window. The spring light was soft, the street below filled with children laughing, their voices rising like music without instruments. I drew the bow once more, and the sound, oh the sound, wasn't his, nor mine, nor hers. It was what remained when love stopped asking to be named. The note lingered in the air, long after I lifted the bow, vibrating just enough to remind the world that something once lived here. Then it faded, gently, into silence. And for the first time, silence sounded whole.